World War II began in the air at exactly 0434 hours on the morning of September 1st, 1939. 3 German Stuka dive bombers burst through the murky weather to attack 2 railroad bridges near the Polish city of Dachau. Their task was to destroy the detonating wires leading to the explosive charge mining the bridges, and thus prevent the Polish engineers from blowing them up. World War II was effectively ended in the air almost 6 years later at 10:58 in the morning on August 9th, 1945. A single Boeing B-29 broke out of murky weather to drop a nuclear weapon on the city of Nagasaki. The difference in capability between the slow, angular Stuka and the beautiful silver B-29 is a perfect example of the expansion of air power that took place in 6 years of war. In 1939, the Stukas dropped relatively small 250-kilogram bombs that were a legacy of the past. In 1945, the B-29's Fat Man nuclear weapon yielded an explosion equivalent to 23,000 tons of TNT. Its effect on Nagasaki cast a terrible shadow for the future. The history of the major air campaigns of World War II chronicles the changing concepts of air power. It ranges from the almost wistful projections of Billy Mitchell about the potential for long-range bombing to the horrifying reality of nuclear devastation. When the war began, every country had a concept of air power that was simple and erroneous. There was no genuine understanding of the degree of effort that the achievement and application of true aerial supremacy required. It would take almost 6 years of desperate battle and an immense expenditure of lives and materiel before true air power would be defined in the skies over Japan.
In the 1930s, the interval between the 2 world wars, the threat of air power was overriding in the minds of leading British politicians. In 1932, Britain's Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin declared that the bomber will always get through. He warned that unless bombers were banned, European civilization would be destroyed. The public developed an image of an avalanche of bombers leveling cities and killing the populace with poison gas. This overestimation of the ability of bombers is difficult to understand. No military staff bothered to quantify the potential of air power to inflict damage. In 1936, Britain and France trembled at the thought of an air war with Germany. Rather than offend Hitler, they violated the treaties of Versailles and Locarno by permitting German remilitarization of the Rhineland.
The German bomber force that caused England and France to tremble was made up of Junkers Ju-52 bombers. They were converted passenger transports that could only just reach England from German airfields, but not while carrying bombs. Also, Germany had almost no aerial bombs in its arsenal. Military authorities estimated that each ton of bombs would cause 72 deaths. It seemed that the population of London and Paris would be decimated by a German attack. This figure was highly inflated, but combined with the public horror of the effects of poison gas, it caused the fear of German air power to grow.
The military did not counter these claims. English and French military preparedness was poor. The military was prepared to accept any public support, no matter how hysterical. British defense spending was dictated by the 10-year rule. It was based on the assumption that there would be no war in the next 10 years. It was not intended to stifle new defense ideas, but to avoid the cost of large-scale production that could become obsolete. For politicians, it was an attractive way of avoiding major defense spending. But it was devastating in terms of engineering and industrial planning. Lack of spending destroyed the defense industry's base. It weakened Britain's capacity to negotiate with rival countries. Even in the 1930s, it took 4 years to develop an aircraft from concept to construction. It took 7 years to develop an engine. So in 1938, Britain's defense rested on old-fashioned biplanes with fixed landing gear that would not have looked out of place on the Western Front in World War I. New, modern fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires, were available only in small numbers. But ironically, if war had come in 1938, Britain's tiny air force would have been strong enough to resist the German Luftwaffe. Germany's aerial strength was a fiction. The German bluff was accepted by British Prime Minister Chamberlain, who knew how weak the British forces were.
Germany should have been the least threatening of all the major European powers. It had been weakened by World War I. It was denied new weapons by the Treaty of Versailles. It was wrecked by political dissension. Its currency suffered immense inflation. But new factories had been built. Industry was subsidized and staffed by the best and brightest of German engineering talent. Germany pioneered strategic bombing with success in World War I. But in the 30s, it ignored bombing and cast air power as the handmaiden of the army.
But Britain, having been on the receiving end of Germany's bombs, was determined to have a strategic bombing capability of its own. Also, unlike Germany, England's Royal Air Force almost completely ignored the concept of cooperation with the army.
France and the United States spent a great deal of their small Air Force budgets on observation planes to be used in direct cooperation with their armies. The French wasted millions of francs on multi-purpose aircraft that were useless either as fighters or bombers. Their large crews called them collective coffins. Almost all commanders in World War II recognized that air superiority was necessary to permit successful ground operations. What they did not recognize was the amount of money, time, training, and personnel necessary to achieve air superiority. All the great powers of the world, except the Soviet Union, planned on air forces with a total strength of only about 5,000 aircraft. They might have about 800 bombers and 600 fighters ready for combat. This view of the scale of air combat missed by 1,000% what ultimately would be required. It underlay the misuse of air power that occurred throughout the war.
By 1938, Hitler had convinced the world that Germany possessed the greatest air force in history. Unfortunately for the fatherland and its performance in the war that was about to erupt, he had also convinced himself.
Nach einem Jahr kann ich euch hier wieder begrüßen. Ihr seid heute hier in dieser Muschel nur ein Ausschnitt dessen, was außer ihr über ganz Deutschland steht.
At the same time, England was frantically scrambling to rescue the Royal Air Force from years of neglect. It bought new fighters. It established the designs for new heavy bombers.
The United States was in a position to capitalize on the European emergency. It was able to design new aircraft and sell them to the Allies.
The Soviet Union was secretly building a larger air force than anyone believed possible. But they would not be ready for the plunge into war with Germany.
Japan was, in even greater secrecy than the Soviet Union, creating small but proficient Army and Navy air forces. They would be at their peak precisely as Japan entered the war.
In the autumn of 1938, tension in Europe was higher than at any time since the beginning of World War I. Adolf Hitler proclaimed that he would no longer suffer the mistreatment of people of German descent in the Czech Sudetenland. 3.5 million Sudeten Germans were demanding unity with the fatherland. Hitler saw the occupation of Czechoslovakia as a first step to dealing with Poland and then with Russia. Czechoslovakia was a difficult challenge. The Czechs had 35 military divisions. The Czech army was well trained and superbly armed by the Skoda works. Skoda produced arms, artillery and tanks. In the mountains on the German frontier, Czech engineers had built a system of defenses considered by many to be superior to France's famous Maginot Line. At some points, the fortification belt ran back as far as the city of Prague. The Czechs expected to be able to withstand a German invasion for months. The German military command knew that they could not survive a war against the combined powers of Czechoslovakia, England, France and Russia, all of whom would be supported by the United States. But Hitler maintained that the leaders of these countries did not have the stomach for war and would back down in a crisis.
Appeasement of Germany was the policy of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. France was terrified at the thought of war with Germany without England at its side. France went along with appeasement. It reneged on its treaty to defend Czechoslovakia. But the fact is that France's 68 regular divisions could easily have brushed aside the German force that opposed it. The Soviet Union withdrew from its agreement to defend Czechoslovakia on the grounds that France had reneged. Czechoslovakia had been deserted by its major allies. It chose to give up.
Hitler's ally and Italy's Duce Benito Mussolini proposed a meeting of nations in Munich on September 29, 1938. France and England were invited to attend. Czechoslovakia was excluded. France and England agreed to allow Germany to strip the Sudetenland away from Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland happened to be the location of Czechoslovakia's major defenses.
Neville Chamberlain agreed to every German request with eagerness. He was happy to see his policy of appeasement working so well, anxious to fly home to England with the piece of paper that he believed would mean peace in our time.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
In early 1939, the German economic situation worsened. Hitler's rearmament policy brought the German state beyond full employment to a labor shortage. German foreign exchange was exhausted. Hitler decided to remedy these problems by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This move would add to the Reich a strong economy, an expert workforce, 1,500 aircraft, and the equipment of 27 military divisions. On March 15, 1939, Germany was invited by Czechoslovakia to become its protector. The victory superheated Hitler's ego.
An attempt was made to change the situation by force in such a way as to threaten Polish independence. Why then, that would inevitably start a general conflagration in which this country would be involved.
By the mid-1930s, re-equipping an Air Force had become a lengthy process. It took 4 years from design to production, and another 2 years to re-equip and train operational units. While training and re-equipment were happening, the strength of the force usually declined as obsolete aircraft were surveyed and the new aircraft experienced the usual break-in problems. So the timing of the decision to embark on a new generation of aircraft was critical. France made a disastrous mistake in building up its Air Force strength with early 1930s designs. When it finally committed to re-equipment in the mid-1930s, it was too late to have an effective Air Force ready for the outbreak of war in 1939. Germany had caught the wave at exactly the right time for World War II. Its units were equipped with new aircraft and fully trained by the fall of 1939. England was about a year behind Germany in the re-equipment process. This was a disadvantage when the war broke out, but it would become an advantage by the time of the critical period in the fall of 1940.
By the time World War II began, Poland's Air Force was small in number and equipped with obsolete aircraft. But that was not Poland's greatest problem. Bad leadership in the clique of colonels at the top was. Poland dismissed the German threat as an idle bluff. The militant colonels made wagers on how long it would take to march to Berlin if war did come. While the colonels boasted, Poland's Air Force slipped into chaos.
Goering's Luftwaffe had a great problem, which was not obvious at the time the war broke out. It suffered from a deep-seated organizational disarray caused by infighting among its leaders. Goering relied heavily on his deputy, General Erhard Milch. At the same time, he was jealous of Milch's abilities and feared his rising popularity. Milch was dismayed at the way his head of the technical office, Generaloberst Udet, was mishandling his duties. Udet knew that he was not performing well. He was aware of his incapacity, and yet Goering would not relieve him. Generaloberst Hans Jerschonik, chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, didn't get along with anyone. He was immature and a faithful worshipper of Hitler. In overall number of aircraft, the Luftwaffe outnumbered the Polish Air Force by 2 to 1. In terms of operational aircraft, Germany had 3 times Poland's numbers. The difference was even greater in terms of equipment and training. The Luftwaffe was divided into 4 major commands. Luftflotte 1 was headquartered in Berlin and served northern and eastern Germany. Luftflotte 2 was headquartered in Braunschweig and served northwestern Germany. Luftflotte 3 was based in Munich and covered south and southwestern Germany. Luftflotte 4 was based in Vienna and covered Austria and southeastern Germany. Luftflotte 1 and Luftflotte 4 were assigned the task of supporting the Polish invasion. Between them, they had nearly 1,600 aircraft. The two leaders could not have been better chosen. Smiling Albert Kesselring had been chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, but he tired of bickering with his superior, General Erhard Milch. He resigned to take a field command. He was amiable and even charming, but he was also a tough leader who made the most of his resources. General Alexander Lohr had commanded the Austrian Air Force. He was a handsome man with a neatly trimmed moustache. The two men had at their disposal the best trained and best equipped air force in the world. It was staffed by loyal patriots eager to go to war. The Luftwaffe had officially been in existence for only 4.5 years, but it could put almost 900 bombers and over 200 fighters into the field. 90% of the German aircraft were less than 3 years old. The principal fighter was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was one of the classic aircraft of all time. In total, more than 33,000 would be built. The Bf 109 was a development of the very successful Bf 108 Typhoon sports plane of 1934. In response to a request from the Air Ministry, the Messerschmitt design team created the smallest possible airframe into which the largest available engine could be fitted. At the time of its first flight at the end of May 1935, the Bf 109 was unquestionably the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. The Messerschmitt engineers placed the landing gear attachment points on the fuselage. This saved weight and made production and repair easier. But it made ground handling tricky. Takeoff and landing accidents were common. About 10% of all Bf 109s would be lost in accidents caused by the placement of the landing gear. By the time Hitler invaded Poland, the Bf 109 had gone through several stages of development. Most by that time were E models with 1,050 horsepower Daimler-Benz engines. The Polish PZL fighter was 100 miles an hour slower than the Messerschmitt. The German pilots would be able to enter and leave combat at their discretion. The 109's teammate was the Messerschmitt Bf 110. Göring had asked for a heavily armed Zerstörer or destroyer, capable of clearing the way for German bombers by destroying enemy interceptors over their own territory. Professor Willy Messerschmitt did not believe in the destroyer concept. He thought that the large twin-engined fighter necessary for such a task would be a compromise, unable to do any job well. But he tried to please Göring, and by May 1936, the Bf 110 was ready for its first test flight. It was heavily armed. It had 4 7.9mm and 2 20mm cannon firing forward. In the rear, there were 2 7.9mm machine guns on a flexible mount. All of the multi-engine German bombers employed in the Polish campaign first appeared to the public as civil passenger transports. Of the 4, the Heinkel HE-111 was by far the most important in the Polish campaign. It was an elegant, streamlined aircraft with elliptical wings and superb handling characteristics. The original bomber version had a top speed of 217 miles an hour, faster than the Luftwaffe's biplane fighters. It could carry 2,200 pounds of bombs. By September the 1st, 1939, the Luftwaffe had 808 HE-111 bombers. Most were the P model with 1,100 horsepower engines. Their top speed had increased to 247 miles an hour. But the HE-111 had a glaring fault in defensive armament. Its 5 handheld machine guns were totally inadequate. The defect would have tragic consequences for the crews of the HE-111 in the Battle of Britain and for the rest of the war. The Junkers Ju-86 flew for the first time on November 4th, 1934. Production Ju-86s were initially powered by diesel engines. They proved to be unsuitable. Diesels can run indefinitely at a standard power setting, but the frequent changes of power required in combat made them unreliable. The most elegant of the German bombers was the flying pencil, the Dornier Do-17. It was also the fastest, with a top speed of 255 miles an hour. It was never seriously intended to be a commercial transport, although the Dornier factory said it could carry 6 passengers and express mail. Lufthansa, the German airline, played out their role in the hoax by testing and refusing it for commercial use. They said the seating was too cramped. Long before Lufthansa's rejection, the Reich Air Ministry had begun tests of it as a bomber fitted with standard Luftwaffe equipment. When the war began, 319 were available for combat. Its slender fuselage gave it a delicate appearance, but the Do-17 was very robust. It could make diving attacks at 370 miles an hour, reducing its vulnerability to ground or air attack. The 4th German multi-engine bomber, the Junkers Ju-52 trimotor, was a development of a design that originated in 1919. As early as the Spanish Civil War, it had been recognized as obsolete as a bomber. But for the attack on Poland, it would be pressed into service by Hitler to drop incendiaries on Warsaw. It would serve out the war as a transport. The evil angular lines of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka would become notorious in the early months of the war. It was beloved by its crews for its ruggedness and by the ground forces for its pinpoint accuracy. It could deliver its bombs with precision on targets as small as tanks and pillboxes. In a sense, it was a smart weapon, with the guidance system being the brain of the pilot behind the controls. The Stuka performed extremely well in the Polish campaign. But this success would cause great harm to the Luftwaffe. Reliance on the Stuka would delay the development of the much-needed German long-range bombers. Hitler's contempt for the leaders of England and France made him confident that they would not go to war when he invaded Poland. He was intent on a limited war to prepare his troops for further conflict. Having been right so often in the past, he believed that he would get exactly what he wanted. A swift war against Poland alone, victoriously concluded well within the limited capacity of the German economy. Hitler pressed on, launching the attack on Poland on September the 1st, 1939, trusting to blind luck that England would not honor its commitment to Poland any better than it had honored its commitment to Czechoslovakia. But on September the 3rd, he was told that England had declared war.
The British government will submit to dictation from a foreign power as to its foreign policy.
Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, was heard to say, "If we lose this war, then God have mercy on us."
The Poles expected France to be their salvation. They expected the French to spring into action on the Western Front, crushing the few German divisions left there.
Early in the morning of September the 1st, 1939, fog and low clouds obscured Warsaw. But in the air, the action was sharp and deadly. The first German formation of about 100 aircraft was made up of Heinkel and Dornier bombers escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-110s. At 800 hours, they were intercepted by Polish fighters. The German bombers were forced to jettison their bomb loads. In the afternoon, there was another raid by a formation of greater strength. But they too were forced back. The results of the first day's battles were to be typical for the whole war. There were inflated claims by both sides. There were charges of parachuting pilots being machine gunned by the enemy. From the German Luftwaffe point of view, there were three priorities. The first was the destruction of the Polish Air Force and its support structure. The second was the support of German ground forces. The third was attacks against military installations and armament industries in Warsaw. The theory of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, involved the elimination of all obstacles one by one. Then the German panzers could sweep forward. As long as the enemy was alone and unprepared for this new style of warfare, the concept worked beautifully for Germany. General Wolfram von Richthofen was a master of the theory and practice of close air support. He led his forces by flying into the heart of the battle zone in a Fieseler Storch liaison plane, picking out targets and calling in strikes. The Polish PZL fighters were nimble. They could outmaneuver the Messerschmitts in dogfights. But the Germans soon refused to play their game. They either attacked with hit-and-run tactics or simply outsped the Polish defenders to attack other targets. On the ground, the rapid advance of the German tanks overran many of the Polish satellite airfields. In the heat of battle, the Poles began shuttling their aircraft to new airfields farther east. This led to confusion with spare parts, fuel and supplies. They were frequently in the wrong place. The result was a severe drop in the availability of aircraft. On September the 9th, the Polish army counterattacked, threatening to break through the German lines and cut off the 10th Army. But an avalanche of von Richthofen's Stukas blunted the Polish effort. The Luftwaffe used only 219 Stukas in the Polish campaign, but their effect on targets and morale was astonishing. They attacked bridges, airfields, roads, artillery and troop concentrations. They were fitted with wind-driven sirens called the trumpets of Jericho. The sound of these sirens had a shattering effect on the already demoralized Polish soldiers. The Stukas were complemented by 40 Henschel HS-123s. At certain power settings, the engine of the HS-123s sounded like a battery of machine guns. The noise terrified soldiers on the ground and threw horse transport into confusion. Most of the Polish forces had never been under attack from the air before. Between the noise and the casualties, there was general panic. By September the 14th, Warsaw was surrounded.
The Soviet Union now announced that the Polish government no longer existed. Soviet forces streamed across the Polish borders. They were aiming for lines of demarcation previously agreed on by Stalin and Hitler. The Poles reeled under the attack, but Warsaw continued to resist. The city had been turned into a fortress, and its commandant would not even receive the German ultimatum for its surrender.
Von Richthofen assembled his forces. On September 25th, he began the first terror bombing attacks of the European war. The German bombers were unopposed by the Polish Air Force. They only had minor anti-aircraft fire to contend with. Methodically, they cruised over the helpless city. They dropped almost 600 tons of explosives. About 15% were incendiaries. At the same time, the German artillery ringing the city poured in an avalanche of shells. The next day, an infantry assault began. 24 hours later, Warsaw surrendered.
The Polish Air Force had fought bravely, but it had lost 83% of its aircraft, 30% of its flying personnel, and 22% of its ground staff in a little more than 2 weeks of fighting.
The Germans had used 60% of their available bomb supply and most of their fuel reserves. But they had offset this expenditure to some degree with captured Polish material. Hitler had taken a calculated risk when he began the Polish campaign. He had stripped his Western Front strength down to 30 divisions. Only 12 of those 30 were first-rate. They faced 110 French divisions and 400,000 troops of the British Expeditionary Force. As the war in Poland unfolded well for Germany, some Army divisions and Air Force bombers were sent back to the West. But they were not needed. The phony war had begun. France and England settled down to watch the war go by, avoiding anything which would bring on a major action.
Hitler was intoxicated with his victory in Poland and pleased with his armed forces. On September the 27th, he informed his generals of his decision to begin the war against France at the end of November. Hitler offered Great Britain peace, but on terms that anyone but he and his ill-informed advisors would have known to be unacceptable. With his offer ignored, he began to assert himself more and more. When his generals told him that the weather in November would be unsuitable, Hitler assured them that fighting would be possible until February or March. At that time, he was not contemplating a total victory in the West. He intended only to seize the Low Countries and northern France as a base of operations against England. The Polish campaign burnished the National Socialist spirit of the Luftwaffe. Losses had been high. 285 out of 1,600 aircraft had been lost. In a country where dueling scars, medals and wound stripes were so highly prized, this blooding was seen as confirmation of the Luftwaffe's fighting qualities. The Luftwaffe's successes had indeed been spectacular. The rapid progress in Poland had outstripped the Luftwaffe's logistic capacity. Spare parts were limited. But fortunately for Germany, the Blackbirds, the Luftwaffe's mechanics, worked miracles to keep aircraft in commission.
There are some hazards in the German success in Poland. The most dangerous of these was the assumption that the German aircraft in service were fully adequate in terms of performance and number. It was dangerous because the next enemies, England and France, were many times more powerful than Poland.
Hitler had long ago anticipated the need for vastly greater numbers of aircraft. As early as October 1938, he had called for a 500% increase in aircraft production. But his order had been ignored by both industry and Air Ministry officials. The experts simply stated that Hitler's goals could not be reached. They claimed that, even if accomplished, such a program would wreck the German economy. They proved that the fuel requirements for such an air force were impossible to fulfill. So, in the winter of 1939, the German factories continued on a virtual peacetime basis. They produced at a rate of less than 700 aircraft a month. Content with its performance in Poland, certain that it could handle the West, the Luftwaffe High Command was blissfully unaware that English aircraft production had already exceeded Germany's and was growing from day to day. Hitler now began to insert himself more into military planning. He displayed a combination of talents that intimidated his generals. Adverse weather kept the Luftwaffe grounded. It prevented Hitler from opening his attacks in the West during the winter of 1939. During the enforced delay, Hitler rejected his army's long-established plan to attack France. He supported an alternative plan that called for a thrust through the apparently impassable Ardennes forest, followed by a race across France to the Channel coast. But before this major test of arms, Hitler had to face a quick campaign in Denmark and Norway.
The war in Scandinavia was characterized by long distances, bad weather, and terrible logistics problems.
On September the 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Great Britain's First Sea Lord Winston Churchill saw this invasion as justification to seize Norway. He wanted to control Norwegian waters to cut off supplies of steel to Germany. The Finns resisted the Soviet invaders. They cut off the ill-trained, ill-equipped Soviet forces in the dense forests and slaughtered them.
England, France, and Germany all considered Soviet performance in Finland as ineffective. Hitler's opinion of the Soviet Union was that he would only have to kick in the door and have the whole rotten house come crashing down. In France and England, public anger mounted over the brutal Soviet invasion. Pressure built to intervene. Churchill even advocated breaking off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and bombing Russian oil fields. The Allies asked permission of Norway and Sweden to send troops through their country to aid Finland. Both nations refused. They were enjoying tremendous prosperity from their business dealings with Germany. But a renewed Soviet offensive overwhelmed Finland. In Germany, Hitler ordered preparations to begin for the invasion of Norway. At the same time, the Allies were also preparing an invasion of Norway to save it from the Germans.
Hitler's attack on Norway, Operation Weser, began on April the 9th, 1940. Timing was critical for the seaborne forces. Their destinations were hundreds of miles apart, but they all had to reach them at the same time. The ships landed troops over a wide front. A serious airborne reinforcement and supply campaign followed. This had never been done before. Hitler's willingness to chance the Norwegian weather, the British Navy and the Norwegian defenders showed a courage and foresight that surpassed his commanders. His plan was for the parachute troops to seize the main airfields. Then the Junkers transports would come in to offload troops. As soon as the airfield perimeters were secured, flights of German bombers and fighters would arrive to begin operations. They were to be serviced by maintenance crews that would arrive on the second wave of transports. It all worked exactly as Hitler had planned.
The Norwegian resistance increased during the day. At Oslo, Gloucester Gladiators attacked the incoming German aircraft at terrible odds. Flights of 2 engaged as many as 70 aircraft at a time. Britain and France reacted quickly to support the Norwegian resistance. The Royal Air Force sent bombers and reconnaissance aircraft from Scotland. The British committed their aircraft carriers to the battle. Gladiators and a newer British fighter, the Hawker Hurricane, fought valiantly against the strong German forces.
But it was too little and too late. The Allies abandoned Norway on May 10, 1940. Hitler had won the battle, but it may have been the biggest mistake of his life. If he had given enough aid to keep Finland fighting the Soviet Union, it's entirely possible that Britain and France would have gone to war against the Soviets in the spring of 1940. Such an event would have turned world politics upside down. But it was not to be. Instead, the Battle of France erupted. The difference in capability between the slow, angular Stuka and the beautiful silver B-29 is a perfect example of the expansion of air power that took place in 6 years of war. In 1939, the Stukas dropped relatively small 250-kilogram bombs that were a legacy of the past. In 1945, the B-29's Fat Man nuclear weapon yielded an explosion equivalent to 23,000 tons of TNT. Its effect on Nagasaki cast a terrible shadow for the future. The history of the major air campaigns of World War II chronicles the changing concepts of air power. It ranges from the almost wistful projections of Billy Mitchell about the potential for long-range bombing to the horrifying reality of nuclear devastation. When the war began, every country had a concept of air power that was simple and erroneous. There was no genuine understanding of the degree of effort that the achievement and application of true aerial supremacy.
British defense spending was dictated by the 10-year rule. It was based on the assumption that there would be no war in the next 10 years. It was not intended to stifle new defense ideas, but to avoid the cost of large-scale production that could become obsolete. For politicians, it was an attractive way of avoiding major defense spending. But it was devastating in terms of engineering and industrial planning. Lack of spending destroyed the defense industry's base. It weakened Britain's capacity to negotiate with rival countries. Even in the 1930s, it took 4 years to develop an aircraft from concept to construction. It took 7 years to develop an engine. So in 1938, Britain's defense rested on old-fashioned biplanes with fixed landing gear that would not have looked out of place on the Western Front in World War I. New, modern fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires, were available only in small numbers.
World War II began in the air at exactly 0434 hours on the morning of September 1st, 1939. 3 German Stuka dive bombers burst through the murky weather to attack 2 railroad bridges near the Polish city of Dachau. Their task was to destroy the detonating wires leading to the explosive charge mining the bridges, and thus prevent the Polish engineers from blowing them up. World War II was effectively ended in the air almost 6 years later at 10:58 in the morning on August 9th, 1945. A single Boeing B-29 broke out of murky weather to drop a nuclear weapon on the city of Nagasaki.
The German bomber force that caused England and France to tremble was made up of Junkers Ju-52 bombers. They were converted passenger transports that could only just reach England from German airfields, but not while carrying bombs. Also, Germany had almost no aerial bombs in its arsenal. Military authorities estimated that each ton of bombs would cause 72 deaths. It seemed that the population of London and Paris would be decimated by a German attack. This figure was highly inflated, but combined with the public horror of the effects of poison gas, it caused the fear of German air power to grow.
The military did not counter these claims. English and French military preparedness was poor. The military was prepared to accept any public support, no matter how hysteric.
Required. It would take almost 6 years of desperate battle and an immense expenditure of lives and materiel before true air power would be defined in the skies over Japan.
In the 1930s, the interval between the 2 world wars, the threat of air power was overriding in the minds of leading British politicians. In 1932, Britain's Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin declared that the bomber will always get through. He warned that unless bombers were banned, European civilization would be destroyed. the public developed an image of an avalanche of bombers leveling cities and killing the populace with poison gas. This overestimation of the ability of bombers is difficult to understand. No military staff bothered to quantify the potential of air power to inflict damage. In 1936, Britain and France trembled at the thought of an air war with Germany. Rather than offend Hitler, they violated the treaties of Versailles and Locarno by permitting German remilitarization of the Rhineland.